Welcome to Idaho Home Garden Tips, and we try to talk about all things gardening, at least as much as we can. And boy, harvesting, I just went out and my wife and I picked a couple of gallons of raspberries, and so now I got to figure out what to do with them, right? So we've got Deanna Polson from Jefferson County, the SCS agent there, is going to talk to us tonight about dehydrating garden produce.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here this evening. Thank you for having me. Like Ron mentioned, I'm the family consumer science educator here in Jefferson County, so I'm not too far from those of you in the Idaho Falls area. And tonight my topic is dehydrating your garden produce. And this is a really fun topic. I love this topic because it is the easiest way to preserve your garden. It is also the most cost-effective way if you are just getting started with food preservation. We're going to review the science behind dehydrating so you can understand what makes this so simple and effective. And then we'll evaluate what equipment can be used to dehydrate your garden. We'll talk about the produce that can be dehydrated easily, fruits and vegetables. We're not going to really touch on jerky. The word jerky shows up twice in this presentation, but we're not really going to get into that unless you have, dying questions at the very end. So with that said, dehydrating is the first form of food preservation that is known to man. And this is the process of removing moisture so that pathogens and spoiling microbes, they cannot grow. When water content is below 30%, typically between 5 and 25%, that is going to be ideal. Again, it depends on the produce you're going to be dehydrating as well. So dehydrating also takes up minimal storage. It doesn't weigh very much, so you can store a lot of it on shelves. You can carry it with you if you need to for recreation or in an emergency, and it's fairly inexpensive. You don't have to have expensive pressure cookers. You can use a variety of containers to store it when you're all done, which we'll talk about near the end here. So if you're just getting started in food preservation, this is my recommendation, is to start here. So from a food safety perspective, water activity is reduced below the microorganism's ability to grow, meaning we removed so much moisture that the organism most likely is killed, but if it's not killed, it's at least dormant. So it can't multiply any longer. It's not going to spoil the food anymore. You'll notice here I have a handy little chart that just kind of notes that when the water activity is really high, the Clostridium botulinum microorganism cannot grow below that 0.97 water activity level. And then we can see here as we go down those numbers there that the practical limit for growth of spoilage molds is 0.7. And if something has a high sugar content, meaning the sugar molecules have bonded with the water and taken up those water molecules, then we also can't get, those microbes are not going to grow anymore as well. So sugar is one thing that it helps us to preserve. Salt is another way that we can achieve that. So the absolute limit for growth of any microorganism is at that 0.6 level. So we've inactivated these molecules, these microbes and pathogens. They are not going to continue to reproduce or grow. So that means we want to, as soon as we can harvest our fruits and vegetables, we want to start that processing. So we don't want to harvest them and let them sit around on the counter for multiple days if we can help it. Okay, that means we need to harvest at an optimal time, which I'll talk about in just a moment. One thing to note is that most vegetables should be blanched, and they can be either blanched in boiling water or in steam. You can also use your microwave. Not as efficient because sometimes you get pockets of hot and cold, so boiling water blanching is ideal. Another way you can reduce these pathogens' chances of growing is to utilize citric acid in that blanching water. If you're doing vegetables that are not green. If you are doing green vegetables, they will tend to turn olive color. They won't stay bright if you're using something like a citric acid. Most fruits do not need to be blanched. In fact, I can't think of any fruits that need to be blanched. Sometimes we'll put peaches in boiling water to remove the skins, but we're not doing that as a as a way to pre-treat per se. It is a way to remove the skins and any bacteria that might be on the fruit itself, but we're not blanching it in the same way that we would blanch the vegetables. So there are a variety of ways for us to dehydrate our fruits and vegetables. And the successful drying and dehydrating depends on how hot the unit is. So if it's too hot, it's going to cook the food, which will result in the produce having like a crust or a skin on it. And then the inside below that the moisture can't escape. So we want to make sure that it's not too hot, but if it's too cold and we have that raw produce out, and remember we've taken off the protective skins, then what can happen is those microorganisms can reproduce and the food could spoil. So we have to have the right temperature. We need to have some sort of air movement so that that moisture that's evaporating from the heat is carried away from the produce. And then we have to have a dry air to absorb that released moisture. So the most effective way you'll notice in the next couple of slides will be with electric dehydrators, but there are additional ways as well, using ovens, like a regular oven from your kitchen, a sun oven or a solar oven, or just the sun. So our objective when we are dehydrating our garden produce is to remove the moisture as quickly as possible at a temperature that does not seriously affect the flavor, texture, and color of the food. Okay, we want to retain those vitamins and nutrients that are in the food. Some people will think, oh, I'm going to cook this food and retain all of its nutrients. And when you boil food and the nutrients are then in the water and we dump that water off, we're not retaining those nutrients. So if we're talking about the healthiest way to preserve food, it's going to be dehydrating and freezing, because we're not dumping those nutrients off like we possibly could in a canning situation. Okay, so electric dehydrator. And as I talk about these different appliances, please note that all of these images are just to showcase design and mechanics of the unit, and the University of Idaho is not endorsing any particular brand or style or anything like that. So here are two popular appliances for electric dehydrators, and electric dehydrators result in the best quality for dried products. In this, the top one, it's a circular design. The fan is on the bottom and the air is allowed to circulate in a circular motion from the fan on the bottom. And these are typically, they have like a double wall of the plastic, and they have a variety of different tray liners. The heat source is an enclosed heating element. The wattage will vary, so you'll need to just double check what wattage of an appliance you have. You want to make sure that the thermostat can be maintained between 130 and 150 degrees. And you'll notice on this model that there is a dial. These dials can vary up to 40 degrees, so it's important to check them regularly, and I would say probably yearly. And you can use that with do that with an oven thermometer to check to make sure that it's the temperature that you are expecting. You want to make sure they have good air circulation. I kind of already mentioned how the fan's on bottom and blows the air up in a circular motion. And to note this square one on bottom, the fan in this unit is in the back of the unit, and it blows from the back. So the heating element is also in the back there. So you want to just take a look at the trays and the style of trays and pick something that works best for you. Typically the trays will be a food grade stainless steel, Teflon coated fiberglass, or a plastic. I was able to buy additional trays for my personal dehydrator at home the trays do not have any holes, and they're perfect for fruit leather. And so you can potentially buy additional parts and pieces and accessories, if you will, for your electric dehydrators. If they're newer models, it's easier to get those. You want to make sure that those are double walled because they do retain heat better, or that the material is insulated, such as the square Excalibur dehydrator here on the bottom. And I've already mentioned it having a source of replacement parts, because sometimes, even though we take good care of our things, sometimes trays can break, or they can be dropped or crack after a lot of use, after a lot of years. And so that can be nice to be able to get replacement parts. Okay, oven drying. Oven drying is great for drying small amounts and sometimes herbs. Typically, we want to make sure that we can prop that door open. Most newer ovens within the last 30 years have a natural divot in the hinge so that it does stop at a propped open position for broiling, but also we can use that for drying. Oftentimes, oven drying will take 2 to 3 times longer than expected simply because there's not a lot of air movement. We'll talk about convection ovens in just a second. We'll want to test the temperature with the door propped open to make sure that it can be maintained at that low temperature. And it needs to be between 130 to 150 degrees. If the oven's too hot, like I mentioned, the food will cook instead of dry. And that is something we want to avoid because we're putting all this work into preparing our fruits and vegetables. It's a good idea to take, 20, 30 minutes, maybe the day before, just to make sure that your oven can maintain the temperature that you are hoping to maintain. Let's see here. Convection oven. These have become very popular, and rightly so, because they are a little bit more fancy and they have a fan in the back that moves that air around. There's typically numerous racks where you can put more than one tray of food. That fan circulates the air a little bit better. Again, make sure that you do a test run of about 30 minutes to make sure that your oven can maintain the appropriate temperature. And also test it with the door propped open. If your door doesn't stay open, I have seen where people have used a wooden spoon. I would not recommend a plastic utensil, but a wooden utensil that has a chunky handle can sometimes be used to prop that door open. You'll just need to monitor it to make sure it doesn't fall down into any cracks or crevices. The microwave oven is another great option, but only for herbs. If you have a wonderful herb garden and you're not wanting to heat up your whole house, or you don't want to get out your dehydrator out of your storage room, you can dehydrate herbs in a microwave. You'll need to make sure that you are monitoring it and that you're not just sticking it in the microwave and walking away. Kind of, consider how you would do your microwave popcorn, because you have to stand there and wait for the kernels to stop popping. With microwaving herbs to dehydrate them, you just want to stay there because they are being dried out, and if there's too much heat concentrated in the microwave, and we know that microwaves can get hot pockets, we want to make sure that our herbs do not burst into flames. So I personally have never experienced that, but we just want to make sure that that doesn't happen in our kitchens. So make sure that you do monitor that. It is not advised that you try or attempt to dehydrate vegetables, fruits, or even jerky in a microwave, because it will, in fact, just cook it instead of dehydrating it. And then also consider that the microwave can only work if the door is closed. So you don't have that air circulation unless you have a really fancy, nice microwave that has a fan inside. Common herbs that will dehydrate well in the microwave include parsley, celery leaves, chives, thyme, and sage. So there's a few options to get you started if it's something that you are interested in trying. Sun drying is the oldest form of food preservation and the first form of dehydration. The sun can be used to dry fruit, but it's optimal to do that when it's at least 90 degrees outside. I think we had a little window of 90-degree temperature this weekend, and then it just got cold again today. So our window for doing that may be over for the year. I'm unsure. I haven't really checked the weather this week other than I heard it's supposed to rain. So make sure that if you are attempting to dry in the sun, that you are using racks that can also handle holding some sort of a netting over the top. We want to make sure that we avoid pests from getting into our food there. Because it is outside, it may or may not be monitored as closely as you would like, unless you pull up a chair and watch it for a couple of days there. But make sure that the humidity is going to be low for the duration of the drying time of your produce, and low air pollution. So with all of these fires going on right now, it might not be optimal for us to try sun drying at this time. Maybe all of this rain will get the smoke out of the air and we might get a couple more warm days. Not sure on that. A good breeze, which is easy to come by in Southeast Idaho, is also really helpful. So you just want to make sure that you're in an area where you don't have other foliage blowing, or dirt or dust blowing into your food or onto your food. Again, use some sort of a netting that can allow the air to move through, but also keep flies off, that sort of a thing. Fruits are high acid product, obviously. So we are safe to go ahead and do that in the sun for long periods of time, meaning for multiple hours at a time. Where meats and vegetables are low acid, it is not recommended that we use the sun as our method of drying for meats or vegetables, simply because of the lack of control, and there's just too many variables. I do recognize that when dehydration was, the first form of food preservation that they did use, they did do it with vegetables and meats. But now that we know better, we're going to do better, right? So, and there's many varieties of racks that you can purchase or even potentially build with materials you might even have at your own home to use for sun drying. So if this is something that you're just getting started and you don't want to buy a dehydrator, this might be the way to go if you can guarantee that you're going to have a 90-degree day, a nice little gentle breeze, and some decent weather. All right, our last method that we're going to talk about tonight is solar drying. And this is just, the picture here is just one example of a solar dehydrator. You could potentially even use something as complex as a sun oven. That is a brand of sun oven that has reflectors that open up and concentrate the sun rays into a central point to bring heat into that central part. And you just want to make sure that we're not going to get too hot, because our objective is not to cook the food, we just want to dehydrate it. So we're collecting those sun rays in a sort of solar box, which again can be homemade or purchased commercially using aluminum foil or glass. It looks like in the picture here that they've used a beautiful 3-pane window. That's totally fine. It may even be a window that slides side to side, so a casement window that can open and close to allow some of that heat out if it starts to get too hot. In some of the literature that shares how to do this process, they suggest putting something that's black or dark to help collect that heat in the bottom. But it looks like this example here has just a simple screen on bottom to allow the air to flow. There's also a little diagram here at the bottom. Sorry, my mouse was covering it up. Not sure if it was in the way for YouTube, but this little diagram here just shows how the sun comes through that glass and is concentrated in that box. And because of the mechanics and physics of how it's built, with that angle, the heat is going to rise. And if there's an opening at the top and an opening at the bottom, naturally you're going to get an airflow from cooler to warmer air. So it's a really awesome it's a really awesome way to also protect your food while you're drying it, but use nature in this great efficient way as well. Let's see here. With the solar drying, just note that oftentimes the drying time is shortened. The temperature is not very high, but what you have is this really nice current of air, and that is what helps to move the moisture away from your food. So you're really getting a great dehydration draft there, if you will. Let's see here. Okay, next slide. Selecting foods for drying. And this is probably what you're waiting for, is to know, well, how do I pick the right food and the right fruit to dry? If you are picking from your garden, you may be only picking 1 or 2 items a day, and it's okay to go ahead and dehydrate those few items at a time. Unlike canning, where we feel like when we're bottling food to preserve it, we have to collect a large amount and we have to make this big recipe. Dehydrating is not that difficult. So with our fruits, we want to select fruit that is fully ripened. We don't want it to be overripe, because if it's overripe, it could be tough and could be fibrous, or it could be soft and mushy, because those enzymes, once you've picked it, the enzymes start to break it down. So immature fruits lack flavor and color. If you've taken a canning class, you'll probably hear that, oh, immature fruits and whatnot, they actually have a lot of pectin, so they're great for jam making. For dehydrating, we want to pick fruit when it's at its prime, but hasn't passed its prime, okay? Some great fruits that I personally have had great results with, and I hope that you will also find this to be the case for you. Apples in various forms, in slices, in rings, in a pulp, in a fruit leather, and even combined with other fruits, make great fruit leather. Blueberries, cherries. I prefer to cut my cherries in half. It makes it easier for my younger children to eat when they were younger. Cranberries are another favorite at our house. Figs are another one that work great for salads. I love to put those in my salads. Grapes are another easy one. Huckleberries. I have a little bit of a bone to pick with huckleberries though, because I mean, they're great to dehydrate, but my family prefers them in ice cream, so we don't dehydrate our huckleberries. They're too precious of a commodity at our house. And so we have tried them and they were really, so berries will typically, you want them to be brittle, and when you shake them, they should rattle. And my husband did not prefer that they were that hard and chewy. He said, I just would rather save my huckleberries for ice cream, but they can be dehydrated. Peaches are another great one, pears and plums. For fruits like grapes and plums and even apricots, I can't believe I didn't put apricots on the list. That apricots are probably my favorite. For something like that that has a thicker skin, I prefer to slice them in half at minimum. Sometimes you can poke them with a clean pin or the end of a knife just to kind of break that skin up a little bit to allow the moisture to be released. I have not had great results with blackberries. If you think about the makeup of the plant cells of these fruits and vegetables that have poor results, think about how the cells are. Right? So blackberries have cells that have a very high water content, similar to watermelon, cantaloupe, oranges, and rhubarb. And some of you are thinking, well, I've dehydrated rhubarb, it's great, or I've dehydrated oranges. I love dehydrating oranges, especially at Christmas time, because it makes my house smell amazing. But those oranges I'm using as a decor, I'm not really using them to eat from. So something to keep in mind there. We want to make sure that the food, when we're done, we're going to be able to consume it. So it's not a food safety issue. It's just the results are not in a way that we could use them rehydrated, or they wouldn't taste great, or the texture might be too off to utilize later. For vegetables, make sure you're picking and selecting vegetables at a peak flavor and quality. Sweet corn and, that should say green peas, not great peas, excuse my typo there. Sweet corn and green peas should be slightly immature before the sugars and the starches develop so that you have a good flavor. So we've had great results with beets, cabbage, carrots, celery, corn, green peas, green peppers, onions, potatoes, mushrooms, tomatoes, turnips, cucumbers, and even kale. So there's lots of options out there. I suggest that you consider how you're going to use them in the end so that you can prepare them in a way that you will actually utilize them. Lettuce doesn't really work that great simply because of the high water content, and radishes, I just didn't love the way the radishes turned out. Maybe if you were really keen on radish chips, let me know in the comments or in the question answer how your radishes turned out, but mine did not turn out great when I tried it. When you are dehydrating herbs, you want to make sure that you gather the leaves when they are young and tender because they'll have more aroma and more flavor. There are great results with all of these listed here, and anything in addition to here, the results will vary because of the different densities of the leaves of the herbs. Some methods may work better than others. So just something to keep in mind there. Okay, this kind of goes without saying, but when you're preparing your fruits for drying, make sure you wash them gently. We don't want to soak them. We don't want them to take on more water because we want the water to be evaporating later on. You can leave the skin on or you can take it off. It's a personal preference. Pre-treatments are really popular and very common, and they are great at not only keeping your fruit nice and bright and white, if you will, but they also inhibit the growth of those microbes. So go ahead and use pre-treatments. It's great. Darker fruit, if you didn't use a pre-treatment, or if the pre-treatment turns it dark, like honey doesn't keep it as light as other pre-treatments like ascorbic acid or fruit fresh. The darker fruits and vegetables are fine to eat. It's not a food safety issue. It just means that they oxidized and they're a little less appealing, but they're still safe to eat. So this is a breakdown. I'm not going to really go over this chart, but it's something that's handy for you to print out if you want a breakdown of different dips for improving your fruit quality and safety if you choose to use any of those different dips like the ascorbic acid, citric acid, Those are the most common and readily available. Honey's also common and readily available. The sodium metabisulfite and bisulfites, just be aware that some people are really sensitive to those and might have not an allergy, but just a sensitivity. It can cause upset stomach. So just be aware of that if you choose to use that method. For fruit leathers, these are great when you are overrun with bruised or ripe fruit and fruit that you don't want to use for regular canning or regular freezing. You can create a puree. Some people like to put yogurt in their purees or mix the fruits all together. I have even mixed strawberries with tomatoes, and my kids didn't even know. And it was a great way to use some of those extra tomatoes that I had to cut spots out of that I didn't really want to can or didn't want to get my canner out for. Tomatoes are great in fruit leather because they are tart and they're just as delicious as the other fruits. So citrus, I already mentioned, like orange slices don't really dry well, but they make a great holiday decor. I guess if you're really hungry, you could gnaw on it for a little bit. When you are preparing vegetables, you want to make sure to have uniform shapes using something like a mandolin, which is pictured on top, or a vegetable dicer pictured on bottom. That helps to keep the items in a uniform shape so that they dehydrate at the same rate. You can blot the vegetables dry with a paper towel to remove any additional water, or I don't want to say sweat, but sometimes when you will cut a cucumber, I can't remember what that term is called, but it excretes like a little bit of a sticky substance. You can blot that off with a paper towel. Blanching vegetables. Blanching vegetables is the same type of blanching we use when we freeze vegetables. And we want to make sure that the vegetable is still firm but tender. It's heated through but not fully cooked. Water blanching, like I mentioned, is the most thorough way to make sure that you are stopping the enzymes from breaking down the produce any further. The only exceptions to blanching, the ones that you don't have to blanch, excuse me, are peppers, mushrooms, and onions. Those you can just go ahead and freeze right away or dehydrate right away. Using a citric acid blanch can be really popular as well for those who are really worried about destroying that harmful bacteria. The citric acid will help to destroy that bacteria, but if you're doing things like green beans or green peppers or even broccoli or kale, it will turn that bright green into an olive green. So just be aware of that. It's still safe to eat. It's just a slightly different color, and sometimes that's off-putting to some people. So, all right, preparing herbs for drying. So when we are looking to prepare our herbs can be dried in open air. That's totally fine. We want to make sure it's in a place that's clean, that's not probably in a window that's collecting a lot of dust. You can also dry them in a dehydrator or a microwave oven. They tend to cook really fast in a regular home oven. So just be aware of that. If you're going to use a regular oven, just know it happens quickly and you have to tend to open the oven a lot to stir it just to kind of get that air moving around them so they don't burn to a crisp. You don't need to blanch them. You can hang them as pictured, or you can lay them on a clean sheet. And you can do more than one layer. They just need to be very loose layers and not compact. So they need a way for the air to kind of move around them. All right, determining the doneness. It's important to know that moisture, there's going to be a little bit more moisture left in fruits than there is in vegetables. Herbs are sufficiently dry when they're brittle. Vegetables you also want them to be brittle so that when you bend them, they tend to break. You don't want them to crack your teeth. And with fruits, they should be pliable, leather-like, but not sticky to itself. So if you fold it over onto itself, it should be able to open up on its own. Maybe not all the way, but it should be able to open up on its own and not stick to itself. The exception to that is apples and pears. They are meant to be crisp. If you do not like the super crispy skins, make sure you peel them first. And that's just a personal preference. So, all right, the last important, I have two more things. Conditioning and how we store these. Conditioning is a process where we make sure that all of the fruit in that container has the same amount of moisture content. Because sometimes you can get hot spots and sometimes moisture will evaporate quicker in one area than another of a plant. And so you make sure that when you are all done, when you think your food is done, you put it in a container, and this takes about 4 days, and about once or twice a day, you're just going to walk past and you're just going to shake it. And what that does is it helps for the moisture to be redistributed amongst everything in that container. If you feel like you are noticing condensation on the container, or if it's starting to mold, hopefully it doesn't mold that quickly, but if you're starting to notice condensation, you need to put that back in the dehydrator or the oven as quickly as possible so that you can get that moisture taken care of. You have to do this for fruits and jerkies, not necessary for vegetables. So let's see here. Once you notice that everything seems to be at the same moisture content, then you can go ahead and store that in a way that works for you. Storing dried foods is great because you can use a lot of different containers. You can use vacuum sealed bags, Ziploc bags. You can use lids that are one piece, lids that are two piece. You can use Rubbermaid containers. You can use glass containers. It doesn't really matter as long as it's airtight and prevents bugs from getting in and additional moisture from re-entering that environment. If you have these old jars with the wire bales, don't use those to can with, but they are great and beautiful to store your dehydrated foods. And don't forget to label them and date them. And you may even want to note how you prepared them or what kind of ascorbic acid or pre-treatment they had, so you can note if you really liked it and you want to do it again, or you didn't like it and you want to avoid that process next time. Make sure you consume them within 12 months and they should be delicious. You can take a screenshot of this if you want. There's 3 digital resources for you for recipes, for detailed instructions, for picture by picture instructions. If you have any questions, what can I answer for you?
So let's go back up to our chat. We have on microwaving herbs.
Yes.
Do you reduce the power by 30 to 50% or just leave it at full power?
You can if you'd like. I have a publication that I sent to Lena, and it has additional instructions on the power of a microwave. You can reduce the power if you'd like. You just want to make sure that you are standing right there so that if things start to go awry, you're there for any potential problems. If you have a really high power microwave, you might consider reducing the power for sure.
Yeah, okay. And then kind of along, for solar drying, I think you kind of answered this. You just let it go. You don't try to worry about that 130, 150 degree range. But I did have an additional question on the solar drying. Because you've got the cool air coming in on one side and hot up on the top, should you rotate those around a couple times while you're going through the drying process?
If you're noticing that the ones up top are getting a little crispier sooner than the others, for sure, go ahead and rotate that. That might mean you want to build something that the tray can be removed and turned. It just kind of depends on the temperature, how much air. There's so many variables with that one. That's another one where you have to visually look at it. And if you're noticing that some are getting crispy on top, it's kind of like rotating your trays in an electric dehydrator.
So he asks again, then, how do you rehydrate your dried vegetables and fruits if they're dehydrated? How do you rehydrate?
To rehydrate, think about your end product. You're going to need to rehydrate with a liquid. If you're using fruit, you could rehydrate with a juice, not a problem. If you are rehydrating a vegetable, you could rehydrate it with a broth or a water. I would probably start with a 1-to-1 ratio. I would also consider putting it in a bowl by itself. If it was the first time I was doing, let's say you have carrots and you want to rehydrate them to maybe put with as a side dish and not a soup, put it in a container that you could drain off the liquid after it's rehydrated. I prefer to rehydrate with a hot water. It seems to plump up really nicely. If it's something like shredded potatoes that I'm going to rehydrate for, say, a hash brown, I'll put hot water in it, let it sit for about 30 minutes, and then I'll stick it in my refrigerator overnight. And by morning, I've got rehydrated hash browns without a bunch of soupy water on the bottom. There's a way of dehydrating sauteed onions. Would that be effective as an ingredient? Absolutely. Again, it depends on what your end product is. I would not hesitate sauteing the onions, dehydrating that, and then rehydrating those if I was going to use them in a soup. I'm trying to think. I can't think of why that would be a problem, but it would totally be an effective ingredient in soups and in side dishes to give flavor, or even casserole dishes.
So the challenge I have with dehydrating is that it seems like maybe we're just in too much of a hurry, but it's always a little bit tough.
It can be.
You're trying to get the celery back in or the onions, and it just feels more like onion skins, and the celery is tough and things like that. So
yes, some way to consider using those dehydrated onions and celery. If they are dry enough and brittle enough, make them in a smaller form so they're not going to rehydrate into their full shape of a diced piece of celery. You'll still get the flavor without all of that fibrous that you have to chew on for a long time.
yeah.
So might consider breaking it down a little bit more to use in soup bases. That could be an option.
My wife likes to dehydrate and I likes to freeze dry. So, so
You know,
you talked about rhubarb, and I can see that rhubarb could kind of be like celery. It'd be kind of a tough one to rehydrate and get it to be a good texture and all that. But freeze drying, it is excellent in
yes.
rhubarb crisp. You just add a little bit extra water to your, and it is excellent.
I bet it's delicious. I
Yeah,
tried dehydrating rhubarb once because I grew up making, my mom would make rhubarb stew, basically rhubarb and sugar. It was basically jam. And we would just eat that with our oatmeal in the morning. And, it was okay. I tried the dehydrated version to rehydrate that. It wasn't the same though. You're right. It was a lot of fibrous material. It was a little bit more chewy and sinewy, if you will. So. Yeah. What other
so do
questions?
some of these freeze dryers have, can you turn the heat off? And say, like, for example, I'm going to, not freeze dryers, but dehydrators, the turn the heat off so that I can dry something I'm going to freeze, get it so it doesn't clump
Yeah,
when you freeze it, kind of a thing, kind of a little bit of drying before we put it in the freezer tray.
absolutely. Absolutely. The best way to do that, Ron, just unplug it. Sometimes they're automatic when they're plugged in, they're on whatever setting you have it on, and they may not have an off switch. They
Yeah.
may it just depends on the variety, the brand of the dehydrator, but unplugging it works great.
Yeah, the one we've had, and we've had it for 100 years, it's just on. The heat is on, and
Yeah.
I can't turn it off. And so I
Yeah.
come up with some other different ways to do it. But I do agree, even with freeze drying, the blackberries are tough. They're hard
Yes.
to get them nice. And huckleberries, I will not freeze dry huckleberries anymore either.
Too
Yeah.
expensive? Too much of a hot
Well,
commodity?
so the thing, and this is, I think, a little bit difference between the freeze drying and the dehydrating is freeze drying, you've got to get the moisture back into it to get the flavor out of it.
Yeah. That's true.
Dehydrating is not quite as much that way. And so the huckleberries, by the time you get the moisture into them, out of them, you've already chewed them up and eaten them. You don't get down any of the benefit, any of the joy of doing it. And so, if I stick it in with my cereal, milk and cereal, and things like that, it'll rehydrate a certain amount and be okay-ish. But I prefer my huckleberries just frozen and
For sure. And most people that are rehydrating their food are using them in dishes similar to soups or casseroles where they are mixed together with other ingredients. So if I was rehydrating something for like a side dish, I would probably put some carrots with some peas and maybe even, I don't know, gosh, maybe even some potatoes. I don't know, this would kind of depend on what I was in the mood for. But I probably wouldn't be very likely to serve just the carrots because sometimes they look a little bit different and my kids aren't going to be likely to eat that. So I'm going to definitely mix it with something else that they're going to eat. Chicken pot pie, that sort of a thing.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So one more question I have for you. When you talk about storing those, is it helpful or even maybe not even necessary to put in oxygen absorbers when you store those?
Not necessary for dehydrated food. There is a certain amount of moisture still in there. We don't want to remove all of the oxygen because then we're creating an environment where we could get bacteria to grow by taking out all that oxygen. Oxygen absorbers are perfect for freeze-dried foods though, because all of the moisture is out of those. So.
Good to know. Any other questions for Deanna on the dehydrating? And we'll stick with the dehydrating. I threw freeze drying stuff in there, and I apologize.
That's okay.
We're talking about dehydrating, not freeze drying.
That's okay. They're
Low
both
tech kind
awesome.
of a thing. So how long does it take to freeze dry? It depends on what you're doing and how much moisture's in it, Morgan. Rhubarb, I can probably have it done in about a day and a half, maybe even just 24 hours, but it takes about a day and a half. And depending on how full your trays are. Onions are probably closer. Well, did they decide they don't want to do onions, Lena? I think
Sorry, how long does what take?
I was just gonna say onions, but seems like in the office they said they didn't want to do it. I don't have any problem with onions. The freezing of the onions, where I get the smell kind of permeate through my freezer, but when I put it in the freeze dryer, I don't get any odor from the onions in there. But some people are
No,
saying that
I
they
don't
don't
have a
want to do
problem
that.
either. It seems like the onions go pretty dang fast for me,
Yeah,
but I pile them kind of thick too. Like I
yeah.
just did raspberries a couple days ago and they only took maybe not even the whole 24 hours. And then I added a few hours just in case, but yeah, those were pretty quick.
Yeah. So Neville, the flavor doesn't go out of the berries. It's just it's just dry, and you can't get that flavor onto your tongue until you get that moisture to soak into the berries and then that flavor come back on. That's why if you take a freeze dried, back to freeze dryers, apologize, but take a freeze dried fruit, raspberry or whatever, and pop that in your mouth, it's like those starch peanuts until you get some moisture in there, and then that moisture will start to spread that over your taste buds, and then it tastes great. But so rehydrating before you eat would overcome that problem, or just be patient and don't chew all your huckleberries real quick when you pop them in your mouth. Let's see. Yeah, dehydrating onions. Yes, you got that air blowing across those onions, and you will get a flavor, a smell in your house from dehydrating onions. And that's the same kind of smell I get in my freezer when I freeze the onions before I freeze dry them. But when you're freeze drying, what you're doing is that moisture is coming out, and it's freezing to the outside barrel, and that's where that flavor, that smell, if you're going to have any, will be there. But it just takes out the moisture. It leaves all the flavor there with the onions or whatever you're freeze drying. So garlic, I freeze dry garlic. Garlic is great.
And you can dehydrate garlic.
Absolutely.
If I was wanting to use garlic in its dried form, I would probably prefer to freeze dry it and then make it into a powder. Because I probably wouldn't reuse the bulbs or the cloves. I would for sure powderize that to be
a coffee grinder or something.
Yep.
So okay, I got another question then on garlic, freeze or dehydrated or freeze dried or whatever. Well, freeze dried probably is more my question, but if it's freeze dried and then you leave it to open air, ambient air, it can pull in that moisture quite a bit. And so is that a problem more? If I imagine you'll have a fair amount of moisture left in that garlic when you dehydrate it. In freeze dry, you've got no moisture, so it's easier to break that up. How do you keep that from clumping in? I've got a whole bunch of garlic I freeze dried and crumbled up and put it into a jar. So now I've got this garlic. I'm like, okay, now when I use it, how fast have I got to use it?
I would probably use it fairly quickly, probably within 6 months. I wouldn't let it go longer than that. So I'd be putting that in every dish.
Oh, I do
like
anyway.
Garlic at our house. So
I do a lot of garlic. I do a lot of fresh salsa right now. I use quite a lot of garlic, but I'm using fresh garlic right now. So
perfect.
Okay. All right. Do we have any gardening questions? No, this is Idaho Home Garden Tips. I guess my big calls I had. Trees, a lot of the spruce trees, we're seeing a fair amount of Ips beetle damage in the tops of the spruce trees, top down kind of a thing. And the problem is, by the time you see that damage, they've already been there for a year or two. And so the death of the tree from the top down, it's kind of after the fact. The best defense is to have a healthy tree, and so you want to make sure you planted it in a good place where it can spread out. If you've got to have spruce trees, I don't have to have spruce trees, but I do have them, but I don't have to. But if you've got to have spruce trees, you just love the spruce trees, fine. Just put them where they can spread. They have shallow roots that spread out a long ways. And so putting them next to buildings or next to sidewalks, next to roads, that's not good, a healthy environment for a spruce tree. Now, if it's after the fact and it's already there, well, do what you can to try to keep it healthy. And if the top dies out, you can cut them out. I have seen some of the people cut them out, and you can treat, but you have to spray those tall trees, and that's a hazard in and of itself. So that's some of the questions I've been getting in. We're getting ready for State Fair, which will start up next week and whatnot. So we'll get some other things coming in.
I was just answering Anya's question about using sugar or low sugar options. And I have a document that I can send over, but I can't access it right now because it's on the university's website, and that is not accessible to me.
Oh,
so, but I'll pull that in.
It'd be nice to have maybe a little bit less carbohydrates in there, but it's got to taste good. You're just not going to use it. Okay, blossom end rot on tomatoes. So blossom end rot, good question, Neville. It's a calcium deficiency. Calcium is an integral part of the cell wall. Okay. And so calcium is needed in the fruit, in the skin, in all the cells in the plants. And so blossom end rot is a deficiency of calcium at the blossom end of the fruit. The problem is not that we don't have calcium in our soils. We've got plenty of calcium in our soils. And so the issue now is then why are we not getting that calcium out to the end of the blossom, the end of the fruit? And typically that's usually because of irrigation issues. the water, the calcium is absorbed with the water. It mixes in with the water, it comes up through the roots, through the xylem tissue of the plant, and the water is going preferentially to the site of photosynthesis. So if a plant has been somewhat, even a little bit drought stressed, and then you get water in there, that calcium absorbed into the water goes up to the leaves instead of to the fruit, and calcium does not travel through the phloem, which then it'd have to travel from the phloem to get from the leaf to out to the fruit. It'd have to go through the phloem. Calcium does not travel through the phloem. So the short answer is irrigate better. The long answer is irrigate more evenly. Be careful not to till the roots up and things like that. Don't over fertilize. Too much nitrogen fertilizer can cause that flush of green growth and not so much on the fruit. And so those are some things that you can do, but to say irrigate evenly or you shouldn't have to, depending on how you irrigate. I have to water. I irrigate my garden every other week. And I haven't had very little blossom end rot this year. I have some splits, but not very much blossom end rot. Matter of fact, I don't think I've had any this year. But I irrigate drip irrigation, and I do it every other day. If you've got sprinkler irrigation or a flood irrigation where you're getting a bigger bank account, you can do that every 4 or 5 days and still have plenty of moisture. Just make sure that the plants don't get to the point where they get drought stressed. That's when you start getting the blossom end rot. The tomatoes are still fine. You can cut that off. Sometimes you'll get some secondary decay in there. The blossom end rot is just that leathery skin. That's all it is, leathery skin. If you get some rot in there, then that's a rot organism that's starting to get into it. And so that's a little bit a different issue, but you can cut that off and it really won't affect the blossom and the skin. That's not going to affect the flavor of the tomato. You just don't get as much of it. So yeah, blossom end rot. I do have a publication that I did. Let's see, irrigation every other day. Okay. So yeah, I'd have to check an hour, I think, might be an hour and a half on that. And then that depends on my emitters are on the tomatoes, they're a gallon per hour. And so I've got a drip line, run it for an hour. And I have wide rows, let's see. I run them for 2 hours. Yep. Well, no, sorry, not that one. The trees are for 2 hours. The vegetables are an hour and a half. I run it for an hour and a half every other day. And yeah, works well. So that way, because I'm using drip irrigation, I've got a small bank account. You have to put more money into it, and it's like asset turnover in inventory turnover in a business. So the water's got to be turned over a little bit more often. I have wide rows. They're 32 inches wide, 30 inches wide. And so I have 2 tomato rows going down here. So I have a drip line on each side of that. So anyway, that's the way I do mine. And I haven't had, like I said, I haven't had any blossom. It's kind of surprising now that I think about it. Haven't really seen much for blossom end rot in my tomatoes. Rigby cut through an inch to a soil, and it's basically a gravel pit. So I end up watering every morning. My tomatoes look like they're just going to die. Yeah, I live by Rigby too, and I've pulled a lot of rocks out of my soil. The challenge is making sure that you get the irrigation deep enough. I understand. Actually, in my area, I've got rocks down about 18 inches. If I get past that 12 to 18 inches, I've got a layer of sand down low. And so that's a little bit, I guess, kind of an advantage or whatever to have that. And I've pulled a lot. I've got some big piles of rocks sitting in some maybe not quite so strategic places, but I want to have more soil there for my plants. Now around my yard, I think they put some good topsoil around that. So if you can get some of those rocks pulled out and then pull in some good topsoil, that would help a lot, Neville. Yeah, that would help quite a bit. So let's see. Any other questions? We're at 8 o'clock, and thankfully my wife helped me pick raspberries. Actually, I helped her get the raspberries picked. So I got my raspberries picked, and she's bottling beans right now, and so I better go help her bottle some beans. Thanks everybody for coming to Idaho Home Garden Tips. We'll see you the second Tuesday of September.